Harvard, brought to you by In Time TV, the world's only professionally peer-to-peer oriented talk show, and we are starting our inaugural show about and for Harvard graduates. It's I Harvard, I on Harvard, sort of a take on the I theme. Seems like with the iPod and so forth, that's a recurring theme. So this is a revolutionary, innovative program. We have a great guest today. We're going to start out with the Roundup of Harvard, which features Harvard graduates affecting the world, or the world affecting Harvard graduates over the past week. And we have a great guest, and the topic for today's discussion will be about North Korea. We also have other guests lined up in the future, including museum directors and people around the world, actually, Harvard graduates. So we're looking forward to not only an exciting episode today, but going forward. So welcome, and let's start with the quick Harvard Roundup. So starting out first, we have William Fitzsimmons, graduated in 67 with an education doctorate in 71. He made the news this past week, in the Boston Globe at a meeting of college administrators and college admissions directors. As you know, he's the dean of admissions at Harvard, and he pointed out, quote, "The misconception is you get financial aid only if you are poor." This was reported in the Boston Globe on September 27th. And Fitzsimmons and other officials at leading universities are increasingly reaching out to the middle class. And in fact, he noted that they're offering grants to families that are earning greater than $100,000 a year, or even $180,000 a year, and so forth. And to the extent that we've also heard in the news about an increasing rich-poor divide, ex-Senator John Edwards speaks about that often. To the extent that Harvard is continuing to help make this a land of opportunity, we'll see if North Korea has that same framework. But to the extent that Harvard is contributing to that, that's a good thing. We'll see later why I brought this up. So Bill Fitzsimmons in the news. Also in the news last week is Sophie Currier, a Harvard medical student, also got her PhD from Harvard Medical School, so she's an MD PhD student in 1991, and will be getting her medical degree this year and going to Mass General Hospital. The problem is she has to take her Part 2, Step 2 of the National Medical Boards, and she has a 4-month-old baby and is currently breastfeeding the baby. So there was an extended court fight, actually, between her and the National Board of Medical Examiners, and she won an appeal with a state appeals court judge, allowing her to have extra time during the National Board's exam to accommodate her situation. What's interesting about this is I think it's less an issue about feminism and all those very important issues, but about the very rigid medical profession and how that accommodates changing social values and obviously meets the needs of patients. So she undoubtedly very accomplished, will be a great doctor, I'm sure, but looks like she may have a legal or political career ahead of her. On a more tragic note, Dr. Edmund Sonnenblick, a pioneer in heart treatments, was reported to have died at the age of 74. He graduated from the medical school at Harvard at 1958, and a lot of techniques such as beta blockers and ACE inhibitors can be attributed to his groundbreaking basic research. Now, the reason I brought up the Bill Fitzsimmons, Dean of Admissions, making the Harvard education more accessible to the middle class is, in fact, the Forbes 400 just came out this past week, and then you'll see in the picture a lot of red and crimson circles. Those ovals are Harvard graduates that are in the Forbes 400, and in fact, it turns out that over 10% of the 400 richest Americans have a Harvard degree, and that is the highest among any school. And the second place is not Yale, but in fact Stanford. But if you look at undergraduates, actually, those Yaleys actually come out on top. But Harvard, of course, has many schools, and in terms of the whole spectrum, Harvard is number one. So it will be interesting. We're trying to make things more accessible to lesser income families, but indeed, Harvard certainly has that presence in the Forbes 400. What's interesting is Bill Gates is not included in this list as a Harvard graduate, because he indeed is on the top of the Forbes 400, but he's not considered a Harvard graduate because he didn't get a Harvard degree. But the highest Harvard degree holding individual on the list, of course, is his partner Steve Ballmer. So that's the Forbes 400. Another wealthy individual who did not make the Forbes 400 because he's in fact European, but he is indeed very wealthy, but a little bit less wealthier. He's Florian Hamm, class of 82, and also in the MBA of 87, and he's here in the picture. You can see the share price of his hedge fund has declined dramatically, and he resigned from his hedge fund, Absolute Capital, via press release. Created a big brouhaha and actually sold a significant portion of his shares and reportedly a personal loss of $73 million. So we'll see if he's on the European Forbes 400. And then closing out the Harvard roundup is ex-president, currently university professor Larry Summers. And he also was in the news. We've had a lot of discussion about, there he is speaking, but in fact the story is about him not speaking. He wanted to speak at the University of California, Berkeley, and they actually refused to let him in the door. And this is an important topic, not because anyone has any particular view on, obviously, his controversial points on women in science and so forth. Clearly, all those issues, even with Sophie Currier's example, are still ongoing issues. But because we have free speech debates, the whole debate on free speech over the past week with, I can't quite pronounce the name, but Ahmadinejad. I think Jay Leno's and David Letterman's pronunciations are probably easier, but I won't quote that here. But in any case, free speech has been in the news. We've had President Lee Bollinger of Colombia supposedly going into free speech with President Ahmadinejad of Iran. But in our own community here, Summers was refused entry into the University of California, Berkeley. And as the Harvard Crimson writes, this situation is alarming and dangerous. If academic freedom cannot exist in the university, our society is in trouble. So indeed, the reason I close with that story is this is internet TV, in-time TV around the world. I know personally that we have viewers in Jerusalem, in London, and so forth, and that is free speech. We will find out shortly if we indeed have viewers in North Korea. That's one of the questions I have for our distinguished guest, Walter Keats. So let me introduce Walter. Welcome.
Okay.
And Walter is in fact a classmate of Bill Fitzsimmons, so maybe he can comment on that interesting story. But Walter Keats earned his AB in 1967 from Harvard. He majored in social anthropology, spent a year traveling around Asia in 1972, attended the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business, and has visited over 75 countries around the world. And he is now president of Asia Pacific Travel, and they specialize in custom individual and small group travel to Asia, one of the first U.S. tour operators to arrange commercial tours to China, and currently is the only U.S. travel company authorized to travel to North Korea. We're going to be taking a break shortly, but welcome.
Thank you.
And we're
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure, and we look forward to hearing more about North Korea. Stay right there. Harvard.
Yes, you are. Come here. Let's see how this looks.
Hey, how's my little horse?
She's a lion.
Yes, she is.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. When you adopt a child from foster care, just being there makes all the difference.
Come on! This way!
Who is that guy?
I don't know! Hurry up! He's right behind us!
I know!
Come on, get up!
407 years ago.
Think history is a little scary? Then log on to LOC.gov and see how much fun it can be. The Library of Congress at LOC.gov.
Welcome back to Harvard, Eye on Harvard. With apologies for the music, I know you're not watching this for the music, but clearly it is Harvard themed, so we included 10,000 Men of Harvard, the Harvard fight song. So welcome back. We have a great guest, Walter Keats. He's graduated from the college in 1967 and is, I would say, one of the world's experts, actually, because it's quite rare, in North Korea, and that's going to be our major topic. He is president of Asia Pacific Travel, which is the only authorized U.S. travel company authorized to conduct tours in North Korea. Before talking about today's main topic, North Korea, I know that just this past week you had given a talk at the Harvard Club of Chicago, entitled "Highlights from 150 Years of the Harvard Club of Chicago," and this is actually the invite for that. It's over. I guess you can't read that. Highlights from 150 years of the Harvard Club of Chicago. This is Eye on Harvard. I think it's apropos. Give us a couple highlights.
Well, the Harvard Club of Chicago is officially the oldest continuous Harvard Club in the world. It was founded in 1857.
Before the Great Fire.
Before the fire, yes. I mean, almost, 15 years or more before the fire.
That's why they don't have a clubhouse.
Well, they actually, that's in the book. We can talk about that. But basically, the Boston Club did get started earlier, but they got carried away and built an actual, or rented a building, and then they got too much overhead and went out of business after a couple of years, and didn't restart until about 1900. So that's why they don't get counted. But we started and kept going. There was a slow period during the Civil War, when everybody was busy and stuff, and with the fire, etc. But then after the fire, it really got going again and got officially, with legal bylaws and all this kind of stuff. And then incorporations came along and they did it. And so Harvard recognizes us as the oldest continuous Harvard Club in the world. And it's a pretty fascinating story to see how this little town of Chicago that started in 1833 with 350 people, by 1890 had over 1 million people, was the second largest city in the U.S. after New York, and that it was this growth with the Illinois and Michigan Canal, the railroads, all these things that brought people to Chicago as an exciting, dynamic place. And
so the club parallels that.
The club paralleled it.
How many members are in the... first of all, how many... we're obviously world-centric as Internet TV, but in terms of Chicago, how many Harvard graduates are in Chicago, and how many members are in the club?
There's probably somewhere around 7,500, 8,000 total universe of people from all the different schools here in the greater Chicago area, and about 1,300 pay dues each year.
Right.
So it's one of the larger clubs. Also, you have New York and Boston have physical buildings and have tens of thousands of people living there, so they are bigger. But I think Washington might have a few more members, and maybe L.A. or something. But this is one of the biggest, and certainly one of the most active, with usually 1 or 2 programs every month.
Right. Well, I've actually been involved in the club. I've been to events, I've been a member and so forth, and I could certainly attest to that. Very active club. So let's go to the main topic. As I mentioned, Walter is one of the few Americans, in fact Westerners, that is not only able to, but allowed to, for that matter, go into North Korea. And apropos of the Harvard Club, a couple of years ago I went to one of his presentations on that North Korea and the slideshow and so forth. So I thought that as our inaugural guest, it would be very fascinating. I'm sure there's been updates even this past week about some changes in the nuclear arms controversy. So first of all, give us a little historical perspective. We all know that North Korea is a, quote, special place. Why is it so unique? Tell us a little about the country.
Well, it's sort of a unique situation. Why is it there? The 38th parallel. At the end of the war, the U.S. divided Korea in half to allow the Russians to come into the northern half, and we were in the southern half to take the surrender of the Japanese soldiers. The North Koreans blame us for this, that somehow there was some ulterior motive to divide Korea, etc. But as far as I can tell, it really had nothing to do with that. And in fact, when I teasingly tease the North Koreans and say you should blame the Russians, because if they had not, 2 days after we bombed the Japanese at Hiroshima, that's when the Russians entered the war against Japan. If the Russians had not entered the war against Japan, we would not have had an ally there, and presumably would not have had to divide Korea as they did to Germany. Germany was divided into 4 parts: British, French, British, and American. So I tease them, as I say, that blame the Russians. If the Russians hadn't come in, there would have been a unified Korea right from the start. The second point I blame them is during the Korean War, if the Chinese had not come in to help them, we were already at the Yalu River, and Korea would have been reunited in 1950 also. So I'm not sure they buy my arguments, but at least it makes them think about it.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the sticking points was that we were refusing to have bilateral discussions with North Korea. We wanted to have multilateral discussions, and in fact, I think it's the six parties.
Six-party talks, right.
Six-party talks and so forth. But even from the beginning, it sounds like they're fixated on the United States.
Yeah.
What's behind it other than the usual rhetoric?
Yeah, as far as I could tell, it's mostly they need a boogeyman.
Yeah.
Just to keep the government in power, et cetera, they have to have an enemy. And the actual structure is not the U.S. versus them. It was the United Nations, of which the U.S. was the leading member, and that's still what the U.S. Military there in South Korea, and at the DMZ, they are representing the United Nations. This is the oldest military activity of the United Nations. I mean, it was the first one and still going. So, but they never refer to it as the UN. They always talk about just the U.S. They also discount South Korea as a bunch of puppets of the Americans, which in the early years there was probably some validity to that. But today, North Korea is a democracy, and it's the 11th to 12th largest economy in the world. So it's a little hard to make the case that South Korea is just a blind a flunky of the U.S.
Right.
They certainly know what they do and are capable of doing whatever they want. They have a strong military. There are over 40 million South Koreans, only 20-some million North Koreans. So the whole situation is a lot different today than it was 50 years ago. But you mentioned, the six-party talks, too. They need to have somebody to blame. And by, in a sense, personalizing it to the U.S., this gives them an excuse to have a strong military, which, as you may have heard too, they have a policy called Sungun, which means military first.
Yes.
This is the only country in the world that does this, to my knowledge, where they feel that their security is so important to them that they're threatened by the U.S. that they have this policy, and so all the resources, other things, all go first to the military.
So it's not anti-Americanism per se. But
we're just the boogeyman.
We're the boogeyman.
Yeah.
And then we're going to come up on a break shortly, but I want to consider one question to the extent that obviously you've been there, and with countries such as this, highly closed countries, they control what you see. Let's get back to that, but to extent how veritas, if you will, truthful, being there, do you think your opportunity to learn about North Korea?
Okay.
So this is iHarvard. Stay right there. We'll be right back.
Once they've outgrown their toddler seat, they're still not ready for adult safety belts alone. 4'9" is the magic number. Until then, kids need a booster seat. Make sure your little pumpkin gets there safely. Visit boosterseat.gov.
Protect yourself from mannequinism. Volunteer. Vote. Stay informed. It's easy to get involved.
Welcome back. I see Walter Keats, our distinguished guest, tapping to the music. He graduated in AB 67, and I presume they were playing 10,000 Men at Harvard and Harvard Yard back then. I learned when I was researching for this show and what we would show on it that song is formally, the Harvard Band is instructed to stomp around Harvard Yard and play that song, and I think it's very much kind of like indoctrination. I mean, I hear that and I just have memories of Harvard Yard and so forth, and certainly not close to North Korea, but have an element of indoctrination, I would say, in North Korea.
Yep.
And our question just before the break is, you visited there, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but to what extent, even though you visited there, can you provide us with insight? I mean, how controlled were your visits? Did you see glimmers of genuine sort of ability to reach out to people. Tell us a little bit about that.
The answer is no.
No, to what?
No, you can't get through all this.
Right.
And you were kind enough to say I'm an expert or whatever, but there are plenty of people, NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, who were helping with the relief work in the famine in the 90s, who've been there dozens and dozens of times, and they actually get to go out to the areas where it's hardest hit. And so they probably have a better perspective on what life is like for the average Korean. What we as tourists get to do is go to Pyongyang and a few other cities that are like show places.
Yes.
So you really don't see a real cross-section of life in North Korea. The people you see are all the elite ones.
But to some extent, that showcase aspect is a part of their culture.
Sure. Oh, yeah. And actually, this book here is called North of the DMZ by a Russian writer, Andrei Lankov, who was a Russian exchange student at Kim Il-sung University in the 80s, amazingly enough. He points out some of this stuff, too, that how that they actually have a system of dozens of categories of people. I mean, there's three main categories: those who are very loyal, those who are sort of okay maybe, and then those who are hostile. And this is how they divide the society. And each of those three categories has half a dozen to a dozen or more categories in it, so that the people who are the most hostile are the furthest away from Pyongyang, normally in that northeast, geographically, really, yeah, and in the mountainous area, the least able to get food, etc. And the people who are the most loyal are the ones that are in Pyongyang or the other major cities. So there's this whole stratification, and you don't really, we as tourists don't get to see those people who are in the second and third echelons, really. I even suggest, frankly, to a tourist, they all say, well, gee, I'd like to get out in the streets and meet the North Koreans. Well, another book here is called Aquariums of Pyongyang, that was written by a North Korean who escaped to China and now South Korea, but he spent 10 years, his whole family, in labor camp. And this is not that you screw up and they put you in labor camp. It's 3 generations. His grandparents, parents, and the kids all went to labor camp for 10 years.
So the kids didn't do any.
No, it was the grandparents. Supposedly the grandfather is the one that caused the problem. But they believe in this sort of bad seed idea that it isn't just you did it, but if you did it, they want to eliminate your seed sort of stuff too. So it's a very strict system. And what we tell people is that you really should not go out in the streets looking to meet local people, because most of them will not speak English. So you're going to go and meet somebody. You can be pretty sure somebody's watching you, and you can come back to the hotel and nothing may happen to you, but that person may be interviewed afterwards and say, why were you talking to the foreigner?
Wow.
What did they give you?
Right.
And they could end up in real trouble. So our great desire for veritas and meeting the masses, you could cause somebody to have some real suffering, and you're not going to know it. You can come back and say, I met the locals. And meanwhile, this guy is off in labor camp. So I think it's something that people really have to be aware of this society. You can't just go, blundering in there like a bull in a tea shop, a China shop. You really need to recognize that you could hurt people by some of your actions.
Well, when it came to the Soviet Union, people visiting there, I forget the name of that, in-tourist,
right.
Depending on their situation, they'd have a handler, somebody following them around.
Yeah, we have 2. Every group that goes there, whether you're one person or a dozen or whatever, there are 2 guides with you, and we presume that they're watching each other. They do sort of take turns doing some of the translations and stuff, but we can be pretty sure that they're watching each other to make sure that somebody doesn't, again, go get with this guide and bribe him and stuff and convert him.
Is it very intrusive, or just kind of just watching you?
It sort of depends on a little how you do it. That's why every group that we take, we always have a briefing beforehand in Beijing. You have to go through Beijing because it's the nearest embassy, and that's where the flights to Pyongyang are. But we always have a briefing there with people, with our groups, and go over with people what's sort of expected and accepted, etc., so that hopefully we don't have any problems just through ignorance. You're not supposed to take pictures of soldiers and other things that would make the regime look bad. So as long as you know that, you should be careful. And we've had a few people slipped up. We were on a bus going down to Kaesong in the south, and some guy was in the back, and he saw a couple of APC armored personnel carriers with smoking away and coming along, and so he quick goes to take the picture. Well, the guide is sitting in the front on the same side of the bus. He saw the APCs, so he looked around to see if anybody's taking a picture, and he saw him do it. So he comes back and tells him he has to delete the picture. The good news is with digital pictures, it's easy to delete things. You just show them, see, and delete it. But they get touchy.
So that's a little curious. I mean, the APC wasn't shooting at civilians
No,
or something.
just driving along, smoking
and
away.
I understand that they really try to present a very strong military sense. I would think that they'd like people to take pictures of APCs.
Well, I think they're just somehow concerned that somehow, I don't know I have no idea what somebody could use with a picture of a soldier, but you're not supposed to take pictures of any soldiers. Although when you are actually at the DMZ in Panmunjom, there's a few people there and you can take pictures of those people. But I presume the reason is when you look across the line, you see on the south side, there's numerous cameras that are all taking pictures of all of us all the time. So they probably figured that, so what?
Exactly.
It's already been done. But
right.
But there, we had one example. We were in Kaesong in May, and we just went through the square, and there was actually like a free market there. And we were able to take pictures of this thing. The guides didn't say anything. But when we got back to our hotel in Pyongyang that night, at 11 o'clock at night, our guides called us saying that someone in Kaesong had called them to say that that was not permitted to take pictures of that.
A free market.
Yeah.
And what do you mean by a
free
market?
Well, we're using that term. I mean, it was people out there with trucks and selling things and stuff. But so they said in the morning to come down and delete those pictures, and so that's what you do.
So we'll talk. We're coming up to a break shortly. That's a good segue into a little bit about the daily life, to the extent that you saw this market and so forth. We are iHarvard, on Harvard. I'm Ogan Gurel, graduated in '86 from the college, and we have Walter Keats, president of Asia Pacific Travel, who graduated in '67, classmate of Bill Fitzsimmons, dean of admissions. We'll be right back, and we'll be discussing North Korea some more.
Two words for you. Pop quiz. Ready? Name any funny movie. A drama. Name a mystery. And one more thing. Name the movie your kids saw today in science class.
Know what really matters. Know about your kid's school. And know about your kid. Find out 100 ways to know more, do more.
There's something about you, baby. I can't get enough. There's something about you, baby. I got you looking at me, I'm gonna call you bluff. There's something about you.
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. It takes a man to be a dad.
To the morning light. One day these rats were playing in the woods. One of some matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try.
Only you.
Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Mom?
Dad?
How long should I wait for you?
If I'm at soccer practice.
What if something happens? Will you come get me?
There's no reason not to have a plan in case of an emergency.
Should we go to the neighbor's house?
And some extremely good reasons why you should.
Can you tell me?
Talk to your family about what you would do in case of an emergency.
Welcome back. I'm Ogan Gurel, class of '86. This is iHarvard, on the world's only internet TV talk show dedicated to and about Harvard graduates. One of our guests is Walter Keats, graduate of the college in '67. We're talking about North Korea. He's one of the few Westerners and Americans who has regularly gone, or even gone once, for that matter, to North Korea. He's also traveled to 75 countries around the world and obviously a lot of other travel experience, but we're focusing on North Korea. And before the break, we were talking about a visit to a market. And if you would, just tell us a little bit about it, even though a lot of these tours are staged, going to the big statues and so forth. Tell us a little bit about what it's like.
Well, you know, we say they're staged. I mean, the thing is, just like any other place, they're places you should see. I mean, if you're there.
Going to Statue of Liberty
they take
or
you.
something,
Yeah, I mean, so you sort of should go there. You want to go there. You want to see it. We go to there's a big statue that's 20-some meters high of Kim Il-sung that you go to. The thing we've been able to do this year, which was a little different, is a place called Kumsusan, where his body is actually lying in state. It's just like Mao and Lenin and Ho Chi Minh. So I'm one of the few people probably in the world who's actually seen all 4 dead bodies. So I don't know what that will do for me, but we're waiting for Castro to see whether he'll be mummified or something too.
Right.
But anyway, but so these are things that you want to see, because actually each of these things reflects what they're trying to show you. So you can learn from that, even though you may say, well, I want to go off and do this. Well, it seems to me one thing is just shut up and listen. I mean, and you're there to see what they're trying to tell you. You can hear lots of other stuff elsewhere too, but what they show you gives you an insight into their culture and what's important to them, how when they go to these statues, they bow from the waist. They're pretty serious about it. We don't actually have to do that, but you definitely need to be respectful. You go to his body, they want you to have a tie on, and they all wear a tie and stuff in the winter or colder months, coat and tie. So
what are they trying to tell us?
Well, it's interesting because actually when I first went there in 1995, I was expecting it to be a little like China, where I first went in 1975, and that was still the Cultural Revolution. At that point, they were telling you how the system worked, how the factories was an 8-grade wage system and all this kind of stuff. And I expected in North Korea that they would explain how the system worked. And they didn't, and they still haven't. 12 years later, other than that there's this great guy, Kim Il-sung, that, in their opinion, who has led them and has got this great Juche philosophy, which means self-reliance. But they never really explain how does a factory work. I mean, are there pay levels in that? They don't have communes, they call them cooperatives. They don't explain how the pay works, how people get health care, education. Education presumably is free. But it's very interesting that there's sort of this presumption that either you know it or something. I mean, I think they think that the world really reveres Kim Il-sung and this Juche philosophy. And actually there's the Juche Tower, this big obelisk thing with flames there. And at the bottom there's a bunch of stone plaques that were donated by Juche study committees around the world, including in New York, etc.
So this is like an academic field of inquiry almost.
Well, that's what they would like you to believe. I mean, there's lots of books that he wrote that he's some great scholar, etc.
So we may have that as a concentration at Harvard.
Yeah, well, let's hope not.
Yeah,
But,
exactly.
But I mean, so they've got these little plaques, and they I think that there's lots of Americans who are studying Juche ideology, when in fact there's probably 3 bearded guys in Greenwich Village who put together $25 to make this little stone thing and mail it over there.
Yes.
But they want to believe that the world reveres Kim Il-sung. When my wife and daughter and I were there in 2002, this was just after the millennium, and Time magazine had Einstein was the man of the century. Well, they determined that Kim Il-sung is the man of the millennium. So I don't think too many other people outside of North Korea would agree with that, but it really gives you some idea of how isolated they are, that they think everybody in the world thinks he's a wonderful guy. The fact that very few people come there doesn't seem to have dissuaded them or disproved that to them.
Right.
The fact that there's no other Juche society in the world, I mean, no country operating under that system, doesn't seem to have dissuaded them. It's a very strange thing.
So they don't need, in a sense, they may have, as you mentioned, the practical implements of society, the schooling system, the way the wages work and whatnot. They may have that, but to some extent, this philosophy of theirs is so overarching, is that to live life in a way, you don't need to know those other things. All you need to know is Juche.
Just don't question things. It's just not a good idea.
So, I mean, it's very disturbing indeed, but to be respectful of that to some extent, to the extent and almost as objectively look at it, how does one accomplish this in a nation of human beings?
How do they do it, or how do?
Yeah. I mean,
well, I think you learn to just keep your mouth shut. I mean, if you know something contradictory, you don't go around saying it. I think that, like in Pyongyang, there are lots of people who know that the emperor has no clothes, but it doesn't pay to talk about it. I say this aquariums in Pyongyang, they know what happens, and they really have no desire to cause they or their families to be subjected to that kind of treatment. So, and their benefits of cooperating are pretty good. I mean, when you fly in from Beijing, there are a whole bunch. I mean, most of the plane is North Koreans who've been out in Beijing for some reason or other places, bringing back TV sets, all kinds of stuff.
Right.
They're dressed well. They're obviously educated at Kim Il-sung University or other places. There's some outside now getting some education, not too many. So these people are in a sense co-opted. Even when you go to the hotels and there are the waitresses there, these ladies can speak English. Well, where'd they learn that? Somewhere, some university or something. But they think this is a great honor to serve the country and deal with with the foreigners. But you can be sure they're watching us.
Yes.
They're not just sitting there looking for tips. They look at it as a job, and they know that if they mess up and get friendly with some foreigner, their whole family could be in trouble. So it's very, very controlled thing. I mean, people sort of talk about China or other stuff, but I mean, no other country was ever this controlled. I mean, this book here north of the DMZ, there's a Russian saying this. They were never that controlled. They have little speakers in everybody's homes where they can broadcast stuff to everybody and tell them things to do. That in these towns, if there were some visitors were coming through, foreigners, they could tell everybody to be dressed in their Sunday best and be out on the road at 11 o'clock to wave to them, smiling and all this. I mean, it's unbelievable control. In China, in the Cultural Revolution, even though you weren't supposed to be listening to Voice of America or BBC, you could. I mean, if you had a radio, you could do it. In North Korea, all the radios and TVs are hardwired to just the government channels. This is hard for us to conceive of, but they have that kind of control. So you really don't have access to outside information, and so you just listen to what they have to say. And
so I guess that begs another question. This is obviously internet. People all over the world are watching this show.
Right.
And mind you, let me just take a quick break and tell you that you can email your questions to us at ask@intimetv.com. And we can open the questions to the global community.
Sure.
And that begs the question, as I mentioned, are people in North Korea potentially able to watch this show?
There are probably a few people who have access to the internet. Basically what they have in North Korea, though, is an intranet. They actually are into the technology and stuff, but by controlling it so it's just an intranet inside North Korea, only a few people have access to it. They have the servers, so they have all the information that they want people to know about is on their servers. You can't go out and Google things outside and stuff. So, we can talk about that a little more here after the break.
So we're coming up to a break. Send in your questions about North Korea, maybe your experiences, at ask@intimetv.com. And this is Ogan Durrell. We're on In Time TV, iHarvard, with Walter Keats, discussing North Korea. Fascinating and in some cases really eye-opening country. See you shortly, just in a few minutes.
My pot of gold, your daddy's little girl, till heaven home.
It's easy to tell if you've had way too many. But what if you've had just one too many? Buzz driving is drunk driving.
Hey guys, thanks for coming.
Are we in trouble?
No, you're not in trouble. I just want to set some ground rules.
Like what?
Well, remember last week when you hit Vinny in the head with the shovel?
I do not recall that.
Of course not. Well, it was pretty graphic. Too graphic for the kids. So I'm going to have to block you.
I got to make this up to you. This is Vinny's watch, and I want you to have it. You deserve it.
Thank you. That's really not necessary.
No. Come here.
Welcome back. I'm Ogan Durrell. You're watching iHarvard. Welcome to all our viewers around the world, and perhaps even some in North Korea. As Walter told us, they do have some isolated access to the internet. This is iHarvard's show about and for Harvard graduates and how the world is affecting them and they are affecting the world. Walter Keats is our guest. He's president of Asia Pacific Travel. And we're talking about North Korea. We're going to talk about some of the nuclear arms controversy. There's been some developments recently, but I wanted to close this segment just a few minutes, a little bit more about the life in North Korea. And one comment I wanted to explore was this Juche philosophy. What was interesting is everything is very controlled, apparently. Walter was telling us about how there are speakers in each home that can announce to people what to do, essentially, and that the radios and TVs are hardwired to specific channels. Then you said that this is all sort of made to work, if you will, because if you ascribe to Juche philosophy, then you are given benefits. If you don't, you clearly, like this story about the Gulag, are not getting those benefits, let's put it euphemistically. So, in a sense, that practical elements of life don't matter. It's almost like laissez-faire. So long as you ascribe to the philosophy, you could do, in a way, what you want. In a way. Is that how
Well, it's not that loose. But what's interesting, going back to the China analogy, too, is that in China, people grew things, their food, and did all that sort of stuff, and there were markets. In North Korea, they really tried to eliminate the markets. And so if you were a farmer and you raised grain or meat or poultry, whatever it was, this stuff was all, in a sense, sold, given, however you want to look at it, to the state. And then the state apportions that out to everybody. So you didn't have to go to the store to get your clothes. Every year, the government would issue you 1 or 2 sets of clothes. They would issue you, 100 kilos of rice or whatever it was, that type of stuff. And so it's a very controlled situation. And what's interesting, though, is that that's how they functioned into the early 90s. And then in the late 90s, you remember there were some floods and droughts and all this horrible stuff and crop losses, and there are estimates that 1 million or 2 million North Koreans died. And you can be sure, going back to our point before about the 3 categories and the 50-some categories, that it was not the people in the number 1 category, it was the people in the 3rd category who suffered the most because they were the furthest from the city. And there's a book about that where this Andrew Natsios, who works for the USAID in Washington, he actually talked about it as a triage, that they basically determined, well, who was going to die, and they said, well, let's let the low-level ones die. And so they just didn't worry about sending them anything. But when you have a system like that, the problem was with the drought and the famine, all this stuff, nothing was coming in, and so the government system broke down. What little food they had, they were giving people, instead of 500 kilos, you get 300 kilos, and
there
if
was
it's not
some
enough,
quote that they were getting 1,000 calories a day or something.
Yeah, but again, that's probably the good people. So the problem is that people then have to go out, and how do you live? So you had people in the countryside going to the hills looking for grasses or herbs or other things, barks to eat, people moving, which was illegal before. So that actually was a positive thing in the sense that it allowed people, not allowed them, but people just said, what are you going to do, kill me? I'm going to die if I stay here.
Yeah, right.
So they went all looking around for things. People went to China and got work or money and stuff and came back. So lots of things went on that have now caused the system to be a lot different than it was before 1995, say.
Well, let me give you an example of what I was thinking. To the extent, let's say you were in the first category, so you had some exposure, access to some resources of some sort, and you said you wanted to start a business creating Kim Il-sung dolls that maybe had a tape recorder and said, I'm the greatest or whatever. So that clearly is something that the country would like. Is there any freedom for even that, or is it just so
I
controlled?
think you still would have a tough time doing that, in a sense, to start from scratch, because again, the supply, where does all this come from? It comes from state enterprises,
So how
wherever
do
you
you
can
do
get the parts.
anything with any
Well,
level of flexibility?
we actually, one guy we've met he imports watches from Switzerland and stuff. So there are ways that if you can have stuff outside, you could bring business in that way. But I mean, you're not using resources in South Korea to do that. I mean, I'm not aware of anybody in North Korea being able to just go out and buy things from other, suppliers to put together something and set up a company like that. But definitely in 2002, with the economic reform, one of them was that all units are supposed to make money. And that's why the tourism people are interested in us, is that they want to have tourists come and make money. There are people above them who keep changing the rules and making life difficult for them, and me too. But that's, they definitely realize the government can't provide anymore, and so they are having these limited reforms that you see, that everybody now is supposed to make money. So people are hustling more today. But
well, yeah, I mean, I guess if you're paying money to import Swiss watches, you have to have some economic activity to earn that money.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that it would be difficult to determine where the seed capital, et cetera, came from in foreign exchange. To do that, we don't ask those kind of questions, and they don't ask those kind of questions.
Well, we can actually go into that because I think it intersects, how do they make money? And there's been concern about nuclear proliferation and so forth, and I don't know if that's a major moneymaker for that. It's not for me to determine, us to determine. But can you update us on the whole nuclear arms situation? We hear about them having nuclear weapons. We hear about them not having nuclear weapons. We hear about a deal being made and an agreement. Nix, what's going on now?
Well, it's pretty clear that they have nuclear technology, which they were theoretically it was for nuclear power, for energy, but they did seem to be working on trying to make nuclear weapons. And as far as anybody's seen last fall, they detonated something that, whether it really was a successful one or not, who knows? But it's not something you really want to find out. They do seem to have been involved with the Pakistanis and Libyans and these other things so there was stuff going on, and this is the goal of the six-party talks, is to get them to stop all this nuclear activity, particularly weapons stuff. The nuclear power people aren't complaining about because, in fact, the Clinton administration, the 1994 so-called agreed framework, was that we were supposed to build them 2 light water reactors that could not be used for making nuclear stuff.
So there's some question whether they exploded a nuclear device.
Yeah. Well, no, everybody knows they exploded it. It isn't clear how successful it was. I mean, people think it should have made a bigger boom.
So it was definitely a nuclear device.
That's what people say. But I mean, if it just sort of fizzled,
right,
then maybe it didn't work so well. But it's still, do you really want to find out on the second one? I mean, what do you want to do? So
we're going to get back to that.
So, yeah.
Send in your questions to ask@intimetv.com. We're going to explore some of the nuclear controversy with North Korea some more. You are at iHarvard at InTime TV. Stay right there.
Family and friends can provide the support you need to reduce your risk of cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. Eat right and get active.
Impossible.
It's never too early to start reading to your kids.
Are you prepared for what awaits you?
There are amazing possibilities when you open a child's mind to reading. Log on to the Library of Congress website and let the journey begin.
Welcome back. This is iHarvard. I'm Ogan Gorel. Our guest is Walter Keats, graduated in '67, president of Asia Pacific Travel. We're talking about North Korea and the nuclear controversies, but we actually got a question just in, so I'll address that because I think it will be a short answer, I hope, and then we'll get into the nuclear issue. This is John from Chicago. He wrote to ask@intimetv.com. How much does it cost, your trips to North Korea?
Well, certainly it depends on how long you go. This year we were allowed to go. In the spring we went for 4 days and 3 nights. In the fall it was 5 days, 4 nights. The 5-day, 4-night trips included a couple. It was actually longer because you had to spend a couple nights in Beijing to get your visa, etc. It seemed to me it ranged between, let's say, $2,700 to about $3,700, depending on the hotels and how long you were actually staying.
That's not the airfare, of course.
Without the airfare, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then how do you get there?
Well, the easiest thing for Americans is to go to Beijing because they have an embassy there. You need a visa. We sort of get permission before you get there,
yes,
but we physically get the visas there. The problem right now is that you just sort of can't go whenever you want as an American. The next opportunity isn't going to be until next fall, probably August, September, October of 2008 is the problem. So
what are your... Let's return to the subject that we're talking about, very important subject, because I think it will also pertain to Iran to some extent. They're not comparable countries, but we have a comparable issue, if you will. How do you think the whole nuclear situation with North Korea will turn out?
Well, I'm optimistic that it will turn out positively, that in fact the North Koreans recognize that the path they are on, as Ambassador Chris Hill has said, doesn't go anywhere. Where they were going doesn't have any positive benefits for North Korea, and so they're hoping that these negotiations will result not only in the closure of these research facilities, but that they will actually stop the weapons production, sale, all this sort of stuff. And in order to do that, the U.S. has various things they can offer. One of them is a peace treaty. As hopefully most people realize, we're at war with these people. This is all that happened in 1953 was there was an armistice that ended the fighting.
Ceasefire.
The ceasefire, exactly. But so that's what we really, the big carrot is that hopefully we'll have a peace treaty before the end of next year, before the Bush administration leaves office.
So let me get this straight. People are paying $2,700 for you to take them to a war zone.
Well,
I'm
yeah,
joking
right,
somewhat.
right, exactly. But I mean, some people think that. But I mean, the bottom line is, when you fly into Pyongyang, you're behind enemy lines, as it were,
Don't you go to
and
the
there is no
DMZ?
problem.
But
You
you
can
go
go
to
up
the
there,
DMZ?
sure, yeah. But you can go to the DMZ from South Korea, from Seoul too.
Yeah,
People do
right.
that all the time. So it is one of the most heavily fortified things. But borders in the world, about 150 miles wide and 2 kilometers on each side of the line. But that's what's demilitarized. They have pistols, but no heavy weapons or anything in that zone. And it's been that way for 50-some years. And as I say, what's the point? I mean, it's going nowhere. I mean, we need to have a peace treaty, in my opinion, to end that, because this also, in my opinion, will force the North Koreans to deal with Sun Gun. I mean, we're talking about the military first policy.
Yes,
if there's no more war, we're all buddies. We possibly have liaison offices or even diplomatic relations. Why do they have to have the military first? I mean, why can't they focus on taking care of their people and economics first?
Yes.
And so I think this is the best policy we can take toward North Korea is to push them into that corner, let them digest that a little.
Right. Well, I think that relates to another issue. How do we engage the North Koreans? For example, I believe President Bush, and certainly the policy is we never do anything bilaterally with them. We're not even talking to them. I think President Bush called Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-il a creep or something like that.
Yeah.
And then
well,
Barack Obama said that he would if he were president speak. So what is your...
Well, I think that the Bush administration has toned down their rhetoric, and now you've seen correspondingly the North Koreans have toned it down somewhat. I mean, not a lot. They still have to do that for local consumption. But the bottom line is diplomacy and real carrots hopefully will result in a worthwhile solution here. Because, again, as Ambassador Hill has said, what they were doing goes nowhere. I mean, do we want another 25 years of this kind of stuff? And I think with its 2 years of floods and famine in a row here, in addition to what happened in the 90s, I think that there are people in the North Korean government who recognize that they need to change course, or they're just not going to be able to sustain what they've been doing there. The Juche ideology.
Well, I think this is a really important issue. I mean, North Korea, to some extent, it's so isolated, it's not on our radar screen, but Iran certainly is. Mm-hmm. And obviously totally different cultures, but there are parallels. I mean, people have said that Iran needs the boogeyman, and there are changes there, there's need for control,
Yep.
There's obviously the nuclear proliferation. What about the North Korean experience can inform what we should be doing with respect to Iran?
Well, it seems to me, I don't see how you can resolve something without talking to somebody.
Right.
I mean, just threatening people usually doesn't work. I mean, you say you threaten us. I mean, we say, well, no, you can't make us do it. We're not going to be cowed. So why would it work with anybody else? So it hasn't worked with Cuba in these over 50 years. It hasn't worked for North Koreans over 50 years. It makes us all feel good, but it seems to me you have to do diplomacy over the long term to resolve both these situations. But Iran is certainly a much more difficult one. Iran is in the midst of, let's say, friends, etc., whereas North Korea is pretty isolated. I mean, there are China and Russia there, but they haven't got time or money to really help them too much. So it's a much tougher situation in Iran, but I think we should be talking to them.
Well, I think that sort of highlights the point. We're coming to the end of our hour. Richard Nixon made the famous trip to China. He wasn't a Harvard grad.
Yep.
And he certainly had his ups and downs and so forth, but that was very historic.
Yeah.
And it sounds like through your efforts in tourism, and obviously all the way up to more senior levels, that type of engagement is important. And to the extent that we're a global internet exposure. This is iHarvard, the world's only internet TV talk show for and about Harvard. And also, In Time TV has quite a number of other shows for medical and other industrial professionals. And that's a great opportunity for different communities around the world to interact and share ideas. So once again, I wanted to extend our thanks to Walter Keats, 1967 graduate of Harvard College, classmate of Bill Fitzsimmons, who also made the headlines this past week. We started out with the Harvard Roundup, talked about Bill Fitzsimmons, Sophie Currier, Florian Hom, Larry Summers, and this is iHarvard. We'll be back next week. We have some other guests coming up. The museum director of the Oriental Institute. Fascinating story, not only the Mesopotamian antiquities and so forth, but he has literally coached hundreds of Iraqi U.S. Army officers going to Iraq. So this is Ogan Gurel for iHarvard. See you next week.